Hello, and welcome to Principles of Macroeconomics. Today we're going to be talking about Module 3.3, and here we're going to be bringing together the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves to discuss the macroeconomic equilibrium. As you can see in this graph here, we have our downward sloping aggregate demand curve, our vertical long-run aggregate supply curve, and our upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve. The point where all three of them meet is what we call our long-run equilibrium. At this point, we're operating at the price level P star and at the natural rate of unemployment. Here, we call this the long-run equilibrium because remember, this is where we are operating at the natural rate of unemployment and producing the natural rate of output. Now, in the short run, we have short-run economic fluctuations, which are going to occur if we have changes in aggregate demand or the short-run aggregate supply. So deviations in aggregate demand or short-run aggregate supply are going to cause changes in the price level in the short run and changes in output in the short run. These are going to be called our short-run economic fluctuations. There are three main components that we can associate with short-run economic fluctuations. The first is that these fluctuations tend to be irregular and unpredictable. You can think of these fluctuations as recessions or some recovery periods. As you can see from this graph, the orange lines represent the recent recessions that the United States economy has gone through. You can see that they are difficult to predict because we don't know how many years between each recession we're going to have, and we don't know how long the recession is necessarily going to last. Secondly, we see that most economic variables tend to fluctuate together. So when we have changes in output, we will also have changes in investment spending, consumption spending, and net exports as a result. And lastly, we see that as output falls, unemployment rises. Here again, you see the orange lines, which represent our recessions, and the blue line represents the unemployment rate. Unemployment rises as we have recessionary periods. People get laid off, production slows down, unemployment rises. So now we want to talk about why do we experience economic growth in the long run, and where does this come from? Well, there's two facts that we know about our economy in the long run. The first is that, in general, we continue to have technological advancements. So if you think about the level of technology 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, we know that we've continually advanced with our technology. And most likely, that's going to continue to happen over the course of the next 20 years, 50 years, or 100 years. So therefore, over time, we know that because technology continues to advance, we're going to have changes and shifts in the long-run aggregate supply curve. These changes in technology tend to be permanent until we have a new technological advancement. We don't tend to regress back to old technology. So that's why we see shifts in the long-run aggregate supply curve over time. Secondly, if we compare the level of the money supply 10, 15, 20 years ago, we see that overall the money supply is increasing. And we can assume that the same will hold true in the next 10, 15, or 20 years. So when the money supply changes, we're going to see changes in aggregate demand. Now, this might not be crystal clear at this point, but I promise we're going to talk about monetary policy in the next segment, and this is going to make much more sense. Just trust me now that when we see changes in money supply, we're going to see corresponding shifts in aggregate demand. So because we're seeing a continual increase in money supply yielding an increase in aggregate demand, we're going to continue to see shifts in aggregate demand. So if we combine these two facts together, we see that with shifts in the long-run aggregate supply and shifts in aggregate demand, over time and in the long run, we experience both economic growth, increases in GDP, increases in the natural rate of output, as well as increases in the price level or inflation. So in the long run, our economy is both experiencing economic growth and inflation because of these two factors. Well, now that we've seen what happens in the long run, let's talk about these short-run fluctuations. So again, at this point, you can choose to pause the video and work through this example on your own, or you can continue on with the video with me as I explain. So let's consider a situation in our economy. Let's say we're starting in the long run equilibrium. And we have a situation where people have to start saving for retirement. Let's say pension plans are starting to go away. Firms might not be offering quite as generous 401k packages. What's going to happen in our economy in the short run? Well, the first thing that we need to do is decide which of our curves is affected, how does it change, and what is the new short run equilibrium. Okay, so changes in our economy because we have to save more for retirement. Which curve shifts and why? The aggregate demand curve is going to shift because if we have to save more for retirement today, that means we have less money, all else equal, to spend on consumption. So because consumption falls, it's directly linked to aggregate demand as one of the components that defines aggregate demand. So a fall in consumption leads to a fall in aggregate demand. So which direction does it shift? The aggregate demand curve is going to shift in or to the left. Once we illustrate this, we can analyze the new equilibrium. We're moving from equilibrium A, which is our long-run equilibrium, to equilibrium B, which is our short-run equilibrium. At point B, we see that the aggregate demand, the new aggregate demand, is crossing our original short-run aggregate supply. We have a lower price level and lower output. So the result of the fact that we have to save more for retirement today, means that we're consuming less today, meaning that we're going to be producing less as a result. Let's work through one more example. Now, consider the situation of oil and gas prices. In 2014, oil had reached about $100 a barrel. And as of 2015, the end of 2015 and beginning of 2016, oil dropped down to about $40 a barrel. Now, we want to analyze what kind of impact this would have on our aggregate economy. Again, you can pause the video here, try to work through it yourself, and then continue on as I explain this example. Okay, so which curve is going to be affected? Well, because oil is an input in production, it's going to affect the aggregate supply curve. Now, we have to decide, is this a permanent or a temporary change? Most likely, it's going to be a temporary change in the oil price. Most economists and oil experts agree that the oil price is going to eventually rise back up. Maybe not necessarily to $100 a barrel, but definitely more than $40 a barrel. So we know aggregate supply is going to be affected because oil is an input in production, and specifically the short-run aggregate supply curve is going to be affected because this is going to be a temporary change. So we're going to shift the short-run aggregate supply curve out or to the right. And the reason for that is because the lower oil price makes the cost of production for firms lower. Therefore, they can produce more at the same price level. So this is going to be a beneficial thing for these firms in their production process. So we see a shift out or to the right of the supply curve, the short-run aggregate supply, and the result is that we reach this new equilibrium C. At this new equilibrium, we are producing more in the short run, output is higher, and we have a lower price level. So now you understand how we get these short-run economic fluctuations, either through changes in aggregate demand or changes in the short-run aggregate supply. How do we return to the equilibrium? Well, it depends on what happens. In the short run, in this example, if we have a shift in the short-run aggregate supply, because it's a temporary change, we're going to eventually see short-run aggregate supply return back to the original level as oil prices return back to normal. For aggregate demand, we're going to see an adjustment in inflation expectations by firms. And again, we'll see a shift in the short-run aggregate supply as firms adjust their expectations, and that brings us back to the long-run equilibrium. So what have we learned in this segment? Well, we've learned about the long-run equilibrium, bringing together all three of our curves in aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And we've learned at what happens for us to experience long-run economic growth and why we experience long-run economic growth and inflation in the long run. And we've analyzed our market as a response to short-run shocks, shocks in the supply or shocks in demand. And we're able to understand why we have these short-run economic fluctuations. Thank you so much for joining me. This is Module 3.3,